Welcome to The Invisible Ingredient, brought to you by Farmer's Footprint. In this series, we're uncovering what lies hidden in our food system, the unseen chemicals, the overlooked practices, and the forgotten stories that shape human and planetary health. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Charles Benbrook, an agricultural economist and researcher who spent decades studying the impacts of pesticides, herbicides, and toxins in food production. He's worked with the National Academy of Sciences, led groundbreaking research on glyphosate, and has been a strong voice for healthier, more transparent farming. Charles, it's a privilege to have you with us. Hey, thanks for giving us some time to have this conversation. So really looking forward to diving into your knowledge and your perspectives around where we're at with our agrochemical systems, our food systems, and especially unpacking what's possible from. You've been in this space for such a long time. You've done so much research, and I think you're probably one of the most considered voices and realistic voices about what our future needs to look like and what can we do to come back into the production of healthy foods and having a healthy food system. So, Charles,
well, you're very kind to say so, but possibly a bit off base. But just depends on who you ask.
Yeah, look, I think we all have to be a bit off base to reimagine and see what's possible. I'd love to start this conversation by sharing a little bit of your story, mate. How did you? You've been working at the intersection of ag and public health sort of for decades. And how did glyphosate come onto your radar? If you could impart a bit of your story to start with so people get a bit of context around it, that'd be beautiful, mate.
Glyphosate came into my life through the back door, uninvited, and I haven't been able to kick it out of the living room since. I was born in Los Angeles, California, in a big city. My mom remarried. We moved to the Bay Area, south of San Francisco. I went through school in the Bay Area. Got into a college in Massachusetts. Did my 4 years of undergrad. Studied economics. Was very interested in food, and this was the peak of the back to the land movement in the U.S. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, also the period of the Vietnam War. When I graduated from college, my parents had decided that I either needed to become a doctor or a lawyer, but I wasn't ready for either choice, and I wanted to go live in the mountains and experience nature and do the back to the land thing. So I went to British Columbia. Spent 7 years in British Columbia. Met and married my first wife, mother of 3 of my children. Had a absolutely fabulous 7 years in British Columbia on some of the most beautiful land, but unfortunately went broke because of the Russian grain sale in 1973, which crashed the grain markets in North America, and we couldn't make enough money to keep the farm, and handed the keys to the Bank of Canada, and I went back to graduate school, which is what people that went broke back then did if they were intellectually inclined. Went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, got a PhD in agricultural economics, was interested in how changes in farming systems were impacting the environment and public health and the health of rural communities. Did my dissertation on that subject. 2/3 of the way through a PhD program, I got recruited into a job at the end of the Carter administration in Washington, D.C., President Carter, and in an unusual agreement, the Department of Agricultural Economics at UW-Madison allowed me to finish my PhD while I was working in Washington. So I went and served in the last 18 months of the Carter administration, helping them get out a number of policy reports and analyses that they had done on food and ag and conservation. I played an important role in the completion of the National Agricultural Land Study, which was the first national study in the U.S. on the conversion of farmland to residential and industrial uses, and basically the loss of farmland. A guy named Ronald Reagan came on the political scene, was elected president, and of course, all of us that worked in the Carter White House or in the executive branch agencies lost their jobs. But I had worked with a number of people that welcomed having a young guy with a fresh PhD in ag econ, working on ag conservation, public health issues. And so one of these old school players said, "I'm going to find you a job so you don't have to, leave Washington." I wanted to go back to Bozeman, Montana, and get a faculty job and fly fish. But I had an opportunity to interview for the staff director position in a newly formed subcommittee of the House Agriculture Committee. So this is in the legislature in the U.S., the House, and the committee that dealt with all things agriculture had this subcommittee. And I took the job as staff director. And after I had accepted the job, I found out that the subcommittee also had jurisdiction over the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which of course is the U.S. federal statute that governs pesticide regulation. So I said, "Oh, okay, well, I don't know anything about that, but I guess I'll need to learn it quickly." Well, boy, did I have to, because pesticide issues were huge in the first couple of years of the Reagan presidency, because Reagan and other conservative Republicans came in and they controlled the Senate and they controlled the executive branch in the government. And so they wanted to amend all the environmental laws to make them less strict. And their primary target was FIFRA. They wanted to make some big changes in FIFRA that would make it less likely that the EPA would very often restrict the use of pesticides by farmers and ranchers. So it was a trial by fire. I spent probably 60% of my time in the 3 years that I had that job as staff director of that subcommittee working on pesticide issues. I met on a literally daily basis with at least one lobbyist for the pesticide industry. Back then, there were like 25 companies, and every one had a Capitol Hill lobbyist. And I'm a friendly, gregarious guy, and they were nice people, and they knew way more than I did about the FIFRA statute. And of course, I knew I was being lobbied, but I used all those early interactions to move up the learning curve, and I just had never escaped pesticides. So in 1981, maybe early 82, a major scandal in the pesticide world erupted when it became known that a major private testing lab called Industrial Biotest had been conducting fraudulent studies, making up data, replacing dead rats in cages with live ones. It was a really shoddy company that grew way too fast and was really dominated by the pharmaceutical, energy, and pesticide companies that commissioned the studies there. And the IBT scandal had actually started in 1976 when a whistleblower went to Senator Kennedy on the Senate side and told him about their sense that there was literally fraudulent studies being done by corporations and then submitted to the government to support approval of chemicals that are part of the environment, drugs that are being given to sick people, pesticides that are being applied on food. And it took 5 or 6 years for the issues on the drug side. The first scandal involving IBT involved the well-known drug naproxen, which is the active ingredient in Aleve. I don't know what you call it in Australia, but it's Aleve in the US. Very common alternative to aspirin. And one of the scientists, government scientists, that played a direct role in how the drug issues around IBT played out, mostly on the Senate side, had gotten because the managers of the Food and Drug Administration found out that this pathologist, a guy named Adrian Gross, Dr. Adrian Gross, had gone to Senator Kennedy's staff and informed them of these irregularities and expressed the opinion that he didn't think his agency was going to do anything about it. And of course, he was right. They hadn't done anything about it, and they had no intention of doing so. So he was pushed out of FDA, and he moved over into EPA and had a very similar job. He was a PhD pathologist whose job was to go out and inspect laboratories and analytical labs for compliance with what's called good laboratory practices, GLPs. It's an important job. The science that supports all the chemicals in our food and air and water needs to be legitimate science, obviously. So he ends up getting sent back to the same lab that he busted 5 or 6 years before on this naproxen study, the drug, and realized the same thing was going on with pesticide testing at IBT. So he tries to get management in the Office of Pesticide Programs to do something about it and take it seriously. And you know, they said, oh, well, we've got to collect more information, and oh, this is very explosive, and we don't know what the legal implications are, so just let us study it. Well, he knew where that was headed. So he walks up to the Hill and says, okay, what's the subcommittee on the House side that has jurisdiction over pesticides? And that's who I'm going to seek out and give this information to. Well, that was little old me. That was me. So I met Adrian Gross, and he started feeding me information, first about how it had played out on the Senate side over naproxen and drugs. And at this point, some of the key players in the debacle were already in jail. They had been charged by the Justice Department and convicted for doing fraudulent science. It was a massive trial. It was a six-month trial or something. So Adrian brought us the documentation that showed that the same problem was happening in pesticides. So we called Ed Johnson, the director of the Office of Pesticide Programs, up for a public hearing. And our chairman, Congressman George Brown, a wonderful man, an engineer, a Quaker, he said, Mr. Johnson, what do you know about the quality of the studies submitted to you in support of nationally registered pesticides, the studies that came from IBT? What do you know about it? And he said, well, we know there's probably a lot of them there's problems with. Oh, well, roughly how many? And he started to waffle. For one thing, he really didn't know how big the problem was, but he knew it was big. And so by the end of the hearing, he had testified on the record under oath that several important, widely used pesticides that all Americans were exposed to were supported, the registrations and the tolerances allowing those pesticides to be applied on food were supported by questionable, possibly flawed data. So he picked his words carefully. So Chairman Brown said, okay, I want you to work with the staff of the subcommittee and be ready to come back, I don't know, 3 months or something. He gave him a time limit and give us a report on how big this problem is and what you, the Office of Pesticide Programs, is going to do about it. So I start going over there regularly to work with them to get this report together. And so basically they just did an inventory of the chronic toxicity and genotoxicity studies, the metabolism studies supporting all the major pesticides, and clicked off, in a spreadsheet, all of them that were done at IBT. And by then they were doing audits of all of the IBT studies, and it was regulators from around the world at this point. The Canadians were doing it, probably the Australians were doing it, and so the Office of Pesticide Programs created a document. There were, I think, over 800 studies done at IBT supporting currently registered pesticides, of which about 2/3 were either highly questionable or knowingly fraudulent. And glyphosate was one of them. I don't remember the exact numbers. There were maybe 32 studies that Monsanto had commissioned at IBT, of which 19 were invalid, flawed. And one of the important parts of the story is that the Dr. Paul Wright, who managed the testing division in IBT, was a former Monsanto employee who was sent by Monsanto to go watch over the Monsanto studies in IBT and make sure they came up with the correct data and answer. And after all this went down and Paul Wright was charged and convicted and I think he spent a little time in jail for the fraud at IBT, he went back to Monsanto, and guess what? He got an award for his diligent work on the IBT problem. A very public award from inside Monsanto. And of course, in the litigation in the US over Roundup, Monsanto's flagship herbicide, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, many of the jurors that heard about Monsanto brings this guy back after being found guilty for fraud and gives him an award for his diligence. It struck most jurors as kind of ironic and indicative of the ethos in Monsanto. So that's how I got into glyphosate. And at that time, in the early 80s, glyphosate wasn't an important herbicide. And it couldn't be, because if you sprayed it on any crop, you'd kill it. So you could only spray glyphosate early in the season before the crop came up or after the harvest to clean up any weeds that survived after the harvest. But then the genetically engineered crops came along in 1996, and all of a sudden you could apply Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides on corn, soybeans, and cotton, and the use went through the roof. And in addition, throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, Monsanto kept diversifying the ways that Roundup could be used by homeowners, by landscapers, by the general public, for various weed control needs.
Yeah, we're now seeing it. Municipalities, councils, domestic use. It seems to be, as I've said many times throughout our conversations on this podcast, it's quite ubiquitous as we stand now. I wanted, because we grew up thinking that and believing that herbicides were safe to use if we used them correctly. Mm-hmm. I'd love to speak to, like, your research has somewhat shown a very different picture. And how does this, like, how does that differential come into play from a regulatory perspective? Like, is it just that we seem to, these large corporate interests being, Monsanto, Bayer, are they able to just fudge the books enough that our regulatory bodies say, well, yes, you can use it, but we're not really given the clear picture around how we should be using these chemicals, even from instructions on a bottle?
Well, you've got about 20 questions embedded in that one, so I'm going to unpack them a little bit. There's three major types of pesticides: herbicides to control weeds, insecticides to kill insects, and fungicides to kill plant diseases and fungal pathogens. The herbicides rarely show up in food because of when and how they're used. And it wasn't until the GM crops came along that they were often found in corn and soybeans. Now, starting about 30 years ago, some of the chemical companies, including Monsanto, started to get registrations for Roundup and other herbicide companies for other herbicides to apply them late in the growing season on a mother plant to kill it, to accelerate harvest. So if you're growing wheat in the northern UK, and it's a kind of a the falls, when you've got to ripen your wheat and get it dry so you can combine it, the inclement weather comes in and it's foggy, it's cold, it's wet. So the companies came up with a bright idea that they could hire an airplane and spray a herbicide over top the wheat about 3 weeks before they would hope to be able to harvest it. And what that did is it prematurely killed the wheat so that it would dry down and dry down evenly, so that they could get the combine in maybe a week, at the most 10 days, often only maybe about 5 days earlier. But sometimes those few days in the fall is the difference between getting all of your wheat or oats or barley combined when they're in primo shape. They're dry, they're ripe, they're full of nutrients. Because what happens is if you get a rainstorm in it, particularly with a little bit of wind, the rain weakens the stalks and the wind blows the crop over. And that's called lodging. So, people have seen fields in the fall where instead of the crop standing upright like this, it's all down like this. When a wheat crop goes down like this, that really opens the door to mycotoxins, which are a type of fungal pathogen that infects many small grains like wheat, oats, barley, and many of which are toxic to people. So it's a bad thing. The farmers lose quality, they lose price, and so the chemical companies came up with the idea that they could help farmers avoid that bad situation in some cases by spraying the herbicides or plant growth regulators late in the season, and it worked. And in some years it even paid. But the problem is it always resulted in high residues in the wheat, because now instead of spraying Roundup before you even plant the seed, now you're spraying it 5 days before you're going to harvest it. So of course there's going to be residues on 100% of the wheat, and at a way higher level, usually 20 to 50 times higher than what you would expect from any other agronomic use of the products. So that's because this pre-harvest use of herbicides has become common around the world for not just wheat, oats, barley, but edible beans, pinto beans, garbanzo beans, kidney beans, lentils, etc., and some other crops. Glyphosate is finding its way into the food supply around the world to a much greater degree than was the case up into the early 1990s. It's important for me to explain to you that I believe that a number of the currently registered herbicides can be used safely and have been used safely. They've controlled the weeds. There has been no significant human exposure to them because, since the mid-90s in the US, most of the pesticides sprayed by farmers, they're inside a glass steel cab with a fancy air filtration system. The only time they get exposed is when they go out and they refill the tanks, or they've got to deal with a plug nozzle, or if there's some sort of accident or spill. And as I said, up until the last 15, 20 years, herbicide residues in food were rare. Now, they weren't rare in drinking water, particularly in areas like the Midwest in the United States, where 80% of the surface area of the earth is planted to corn or soybeans, and all of it's sprayed with 2 or 3 herbicides every year. So where you have that much herbicide sprayed every year on most of the surface area in a region, obviously when it rains in the weeks after all the herbicides were sprayed, there's going to be runoff into streams, from streams into rivers, rivers into lakes, etc. And also leaching down into groundwater. So the herbicide atrazine, which is still a big issue in the United States, it's an issue in Australia, herbicides like 2,4-D, glyphosate, the acetochlor, allochlor, they're probably 2/3 of the pounds of herbicide active ingredients that are applied in Australia and in the US are subject to leaching down into groundwater. Now they do it at various rates, but they do it. And the reason that risks, public health risks, and soil health risks, and farm family and rural community risks from herbicides have gotten so much more serious than they were 30 years ago is simply a function of the intensity of use. There's 3 times more being used in 2025 than in 1980. At least 3 times more. Now, one could argue that the 3 herbicides being sprayed in 2025, on average, are not as toxic as the ones that were being sprayed in 1980. That's probably true. But the point that everybody needs to really understand is that the impact of pesticides, whether we're talking about on soil health, on water quality, on wildlife, or on people, it's really a function of how many are sprayed, how often, and at what rates. And basically, the more that's sprayed, the more ways that the chemicals in pesticides are going to find their way into your body, into my body, into my grandkids' body. The more ways birds are going to be exposed, the more ways fish are going to be exposed, and the bigger the impact, and hence the bigger their impact on the health of birds, bees, fish, people. It's actually relatively simple. And so one of the big reasons that regulation around the world, and this is equally true in Australia and Canada and the United States, regulation is missing the boat now because it is based on studies that quantify the exposure and risk from treating a field once with a pesticide. And if the companies can put together a compelling set of data and estimates of exposure relative to toxicity thresholds that show if we spray this 20-acre field, nobody's going to be exposed, no harm, no foul. None of the regulators have even the tools, let alone the mandate and the resources, to evaluate what happens when you have a chemical like glyphosate, glyphosate-based herbicides, that are used on 80 crops and used in non-agricultural situations and are in the air and enter in the water. I mean, they're everywhere, which is why over 90% of people on the planet on October 20th, 2025, would have detectable glyphosate in their urine if they had it tested tonight. That wasn't true in 1980. It wasn't even remotely true in 1980, but it's true today. And guess what? Regulators have basically not paid a lick of attention to that fact. Not important. So that's I mean, the world has a lot of problems right now, and agriculture has a lot of problems right now. And I would say the problems at the end of the day that are going to really drag human society down are all about food and water. It's conflict over water, and the fact that we as a species, what we are doing to feed ourselves is having an inexorable and significant adverse effect on the planet, and it's killing us instead of sustaining us. The fact that so few people understand how dangerous the U.S. food supply is, it's troubling, it's perplexing, but it exists. And I'm devoting this last part of my career to trying to find the words and the data and the graphic and the Instagram account that might finally begin to break through to people that, hey, Houston, we have a problem. We have a problem with the quality of the food that we're eating. And the biggest tragedy in this is, if you think about the really big problems, climate change, inequitable incomes, and the extent of poverty around the world, and then the food issues, I guarantee you the food issues are the easiest to solve. There is absolutely no reason why 9 billion people on this planet can't be fed a healthy diet every day. Not a single reason. And all the people say, oh, we just can't produce enough food, oh, blah, blah, blah. It's bullshit. And they need to be called on it. We're devoting almost 40% of agricultural capacity in the world to biofuels. I mean, come on. If we diverted 5% of the acres of prime farmland growing crops for biofuels to high-yield fruits and vegetables, everybody on the planet could have 10 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. If we could figure out how to get it to them and how they could afford it. But, for a planet that spends how much money on war and sports and unnecessary consumer items, we can afford to feed people if it really was a priority. And not only can we afford it, we could feed people a really healthy diet. Now, that would quite probably exacerbate one problem, which is population growth. But, on the current trajectory the world is at, it's unlikely there'll ever be many more than 10 billion people on the planet, and the number may start going down fairly steadily because of chemical pollution and lack of food, et
Infertility.
cetera. But, you know, many people have at least a romantic notion of what it's like to live in Italy and eat Italian food all the time. And I'm here to tell you, there are people in Italy that eat a really healthy diet, and they eat it every day. And guess what? They are much healthier as a result. So it's not like, and there's people in Japan the same way who eat a very fish heavy diet. There are populations on the planet that have benefited from retaining a more traditional diet that benefits from a lot of the technology, refrigeration. I mean, it's not like Italians aren't eating the same food that their ancestors 500 years ago did, but they're still eating really good food, and they're not sacrificing 2/3 of the nutrients in it to make it fast, cheap, storable, and taste the same, which is really what processed food in Australia and North America, that's what it's all about. It's got to be cheap. It's got to be tasty. So you just put a lot of additives in there that make it tasty. It has to store a long time because of national distribution. And so the way that you can create food like that, you've got to tear apart what's in the raw ingredients and put it back together. But in the process of tearing it apart, mixing it with a bunch of chemicals and industrial processes, and then putting it in a bag or a bottle or a box, you've gone from something that will promote health to something that undermines it. And, I've just spent the last 2 months working on lengthy comments to the US government that the government asked for about how the heck can we deal with unhealthy, ultra-processed food. It's good that the Trump administration and the MAHA movement has targeted unhealthy, ultra-processed food as something that needs to change. They are absolutely right about it. And it's probably the single most popular element of the entire MAGA agenda in the United States. I just saw polling today that the highest support of anything MAGA is dealing with unhealthy processed food. 82% of the population says that's a good thing to do. So people are right about it. They generally, they generally get it that, the food that we buy now that's available to us, a lot of it is not only is it not healthy, it's triggering and promoting disease.
So yeah, I love listening to you, Chuck. It's the narrative arc you've just brought us to is exactly where I want to unpack a little further, because you've spent so much time considering this, and I love to hear that there's a sense of hope and possibility in what you've just said. Is like we can feed the world, we can feed the world nutritious food, and that in itself is profound. What happens beyond that? Our healthcare system might survive if we do. But I'd love for you to dive a little bit deeper in what does that really look like from a agricultural and farmer perspective, from a consumer. I know these are big questions from a consumer perspective, and then also what do we need to do from a regulatory policy perspective? Because I know you could rewrite the farm bill and submit that tomorrow, and I'm sure that would be advantageous for our future generations. So maybe starting with what do we need to do, and what does that look like from an agricultural perspective?
Yeah, glad to talk about that. And what I'm about to say is universally accepted by just about everybody that's thought about, conducted research, run a farm. What I'm about to say, it's not, radical stuff I'm pulling out of my ass. It's carefully thought out, well supported conclusions from innumerable studies and assessments of what's wrong with the American agriculture and the food system and what it's going to take to fix it. Okay, so let's start out with the one of the really biggies. Livestock in CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. Beef and pigs in the United States are put into these huge confinement operations for beef the last 3 or 4 months of their life, and they're fed as much corn and soybeans as they can ingest without burning out the inside of their stomach. It's a highly productive system, given how much the U.S. taxpayer subsidizes corn and soybeans. That makes corn and soybeans relatively cheap for feedlot operations. So one of the biggest changes is livestock, all dairy cattle, beef cattle, pigs, chickens. They need to be taken out of these huge concentrated CAFOs and spread back out over the land base so that livestock agriculture and crop agriculture can coexist again, because they both need each other to stay healthy. Once animals were removed from the land and farmers that once grew livestock and crops and did it because of the synergy between the two and the ability to recycle nutrients through manure, once that was severed, that was the single biggest mistake made in the history of agriculture around the world. The single biggest one. When you sever that link, you take off of the board so many of the fundamental biological and ecological relationships and systems and cycling that animals need to stay healthy and humans need to stay healthy. So we gotta spread animals back out over the landscape, raise them and treat them humanely, and feed them more grass, more forages, not all grain. Not all grain. They're going to take a little bit longer to get to market size, but they're going to be much healthier. And critically, when you spread the livestock back out over the landscape, then the corn soybean farmer can now grow alfalfa a couple years in a rotation. And what does that do? It helps him restore the health of the soil. It breaks weed cycles. It takes significant pressure off of herbicides, because if they grow alfalfa all through the Midwest, alfalfa will be harvested between 3 and 4 times, right? So we're talking about 5-6 weeks of growth between cuttings. So some weeds come up, got it. It doesn't do that much to the fact that there's a few weeds in there doesn't reduce the nutritional quality of the alfalfa, doesn't harm the animals, but the farmer is controlling weeds for a couple years without any herbicides, which is really good, because then the soil microorganisms aren't being poisoned by the herbicides. The herbicides aren't leaching down into groundwater. The herbicides aren't getting into the water. And the resistant weeds aren't, proliferating because they're getting sprayed every year with glyphosate or every year with atrazine. So So this is, this is the change that has to happen. We have to diversify the rotations in intensively farmed row crop areas. The rotations really need to be no less than 4 years, and 5 years is better, with a corn and a soybean, a couple years of alfalfa, and a small grain crop. That's really where we need to go for soil health, for diversification of markets, for a lot of help with weed control, and there won't be any problem with corn rootworm. Farmers won't need 6 BT and VIP proteins in their corn to kill the corn rootworm, because the corn rootworm really won't exist much. And the few places it shows up, let the farmer spray it. This big change, it's the only way agriculture is going to be economically viable and socially acceptable in the United States, in Australia, in Europe. Europeans are ahead of us in the transition towards that future. But there's such significant resistance to this kind of change in the US, despite the fact all of the science, all of the experts, unless they're just lying through their teeth, acknowledge that there would be this suite of benefits, once we go through the transition, including the fact that when I started in the 80s and 90s, we would have a congressional hearing or you go to a conference, people talking about farming systems and crop yields, et cetera. We talked a lot about the rotation effect. And the rotation effect basically is when you rotate corn and soybeans and wheat and alfalfa, you get about a 10 to 15% yield bump in the rotating crop because it's not being grown in a field that the same crop was produced in the year before. So, it's kind of, and the research shows pretty clearly that you get that 10 to 15% yield bump without any additional inputs, or very little additional input. So from an economic point of view, so for a big Midwestern farmer that's got 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans, 2 combines, 2 tractors, a couple $500,000 planters, and 2 workers for 3,000 acres, and they say, oh, now I got to grow some forage, I got to harvest the forage, I got to do cover crops, I got to have some livestock around. I can't do that with 3 people. And that person would be 100% right in that the only way farmers today that are averaging 1 person per 1,000 acres on the biggest, most specialized mechanized farms is if you just grow 1 or 2 things with exactly the same equipment and exactly the same system every year. It's the only way you can do it. And if a farm like that transitioned to what I'm talking about with a 4 or 5 year rotation and some livestock, you're talking about 10, 12 people that would be supported on that farm to do the work and make a decent living and go to church and have kids that can go to the local schools, so that the local schools actually got enough kids to have a school. So that's the system will go there. It has to go there. The question is, how long will corporate agribusiness and its partners in crime, the American Farm Bureau Federation, the corn growers, the soybean growers, the Cotton Council, whose financial ability to pay their CEO $250,000 and have all these nice meetings and fly all these people in, all of that's paid for by the fertilizer companies, the pesticide companies, the seed companies. It's a cabal. It's a mutually reinforcing organism that is extremely powerful and extremely resilient and has such deep tentacles now into public research universities, the media, politics at all levels of government, culture, that it's very difficult to change this system. It's very difficult. And for somebody like me who's watched these changes for a half a century, I'm increasingly of the view, and I mean, I hate that I hate it that I feel this way, but the only way things are going to change in America is for there to be some real first-class disasters. Just things that are so shocking and demand attention and a response, that it shatters this self-reinforcing echo chamber that has come into being during my lifetime. When we would hold a hearing in 1982 in our subcommittee, we had no trouble. We never, I can't remember a single person that we invited to come give testimony to our subcommittee, live testimony, that said, no, I'm too busy. I can't think of a single person. We could get anybody we wanted from industry, anybody we wanted from a private university, anybody we wanted from a public university, any farmer, anybody associated with an organization. Testifying live before Congress is for a lot of people, it's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity to tell your story and try to get decision makers to understand how the world looks through your eyes. And we would put together these great hearings with 5 people on a panel, and they would all be delivering, cogent, fact-filled, well-argued, well-reasoned testimony about what the problems are, how serious they are, how to fix them. And for the most part, the differences were of degree. It wasn't that we don't have a problem with nitrogen in the Gulf. It was how big the problem is, how fast it's getting worse, and what we ought to do about it, and who should pay for it. Those were, and those, of course, are the exact things that policy makers and political institutions, government, has to sort out, has to deal with. That's what they're there for. So in my 3 years, we had great hearings. Sometimes I'll pull a hearing record off of my shelf and just sort of randomly read it. And the information that was being shared between the 5 people on the panel, which could be a chemical industry person, a farmer, somebody that sprays pesticides for a living, and a government scientist, they would really make sense and create a consistent enough picture of what's going on out there that the members of Congress who aren't experts in any of these fields could sort of say, well, I guess then we ought to go in this direction. And I was proud to be part of that. I benefited from it in terms of learning it myself. But today, forget about it. Forget it. I mean, there are still some subcommittees in Congress that are working reasonably well, that haven't been captured by all of the partisan craziness that has infected the body politic in the U.S. But it's really different now. And so the public, and even a new member of Congress from Wichita, Kansas, starts hearing what's going on, starts hearing what experts are telling him in the hearings. And they get such conflicting information. And now there's so many channels of information that are bombarding everybody that a lot of people just say, they come to feel that, well, science hasn't really sorted out what's going on. We don't really know. And there's so much disagreement, I can't keep up with it. Somebody else will have to deal with it. And that is, somebody else has to deal with it. That is the problem with the food system, because there is no somebody that has the ability to deal with it. That somebody doesn't exist anymore. The public interest is checked out and on cruise in waters unknown.
That's a big reason why we're trying to have this conversation, is to reinvigorate participation and self-responsibility in some way. From an agricultural perspective, we had Will Harris on, and he's a beautiful case study of what's possible.
I know.
Not only reinvigorating landscapes and his own farming enterprise economically, and he's brought his family back in, and he's actually brought a town back to life. Like we do have these case studies and these people and places we can look at for inspiration and ideas about how we can reimagine our food system, and then the byproducts of that are incredible, right? What would you say to people listening that want to participate, see or sense there's importance here? What would your advice to them be as consumers to be part of a new way and a new relationship to our food and our farmers?
Well, first, that needs to be happening all over the planet. And I don't have a clue how to do it in South Korea or India or even in Tasmania. I have a pretty good idea how to do it in the American Midwest and on the West Coast of the U.S. because it's where I've spent most of my life. And I would suspect that my sense of what needs to happen to improve the quality of the American food supply and lighten agriculture's environmental footprint and restore soil health, et cetera, is similar to what needs to happen in Australia and in Europe and in many other countries. The most intractable problems are, how do you feed all the people in cities? And in particular, how do you feed them a healthy diet with ample fruits and vegetables in the 6 to 8 months of the year outside of the prime growing season, wherever you live? There's a few places around the equator where you can grow food all year. But most of humanity lives in places with a winter, where at a minimum there's 4 months and often 6 months when the food that people eat has to be stored and brought in. So, it's wonderful what Will Harris has done and Joel Salatin has done and Full Belly Farm has done. These are shining stars of what's possible in the future, but they're not going to feed New York City or Atlanta in the winter. And so we really, we're fooling ourselves if we think that just supporting your local farmers market, is going to mushroom into changing the economic incentives in the food system so that food becomes healthier, soil becomes healthier, animals are treated better. The only way to bring about the big changes that are needed to heal most of the land and heal most of the people, because not everybody wants to be healed. So let's just admit that there's no saving everybody or every acre. It's just not happening. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to save as improve as many lives as possible and heal as much land as possible. And for heaven's sake, treat animals humanely. No reason not to, and so many reasons to do so. So how do you do that at scale? Well, the only way is to change is to change the economic incentives in the system. Money drives the system. Right now, the most profitable food that the big food companies can make is unhealthy, or a lot of unhealthy, ultra processed food. That's what they can make the most money at right now. And they are making a lot of money with industrial scale food manufacturing and all of the bad things that come along with it, because the government has established regulations and rules and requirements and is conducting testing and conducting research that hasn't put a stop to the bad things that are part of that package. I mean, look, it took the MAHA movement and President Trump and Bobby Kennedy just to get food dyes out of kids' foods. Why did that take 40 years? You know, it took 40 years because the food companies aren't going to give up their cheap industrial dyes until somebody forces them to. And the only way that the government can force a company to do something that it doesn't want to do, like cigarette companies put a warning on the package, is for the government to lock horns with the company through the laws that are on the books, the regulations, and force them. And how long did it take us to deal with the fact that cigarettes cause lung cancer? So 40 years. 40 years. How long do you think it's going to take to deal with what's in Doritos? You know, or in the average supermarket, there's 50,000 items. And I'm here to tell you, probably 25,000 of them aren't good for you. And they're not good for you for all sorts of combinations, complex combination of reasons, many of which we don't even know about. We don't even know. So how the hell is the government going to be able to issue regulations, or the Congress write laws that says you can't do this anymore because it's making food unhealthy, when we don't even know what it is that makes the food unhealthy? We just know it's unhealthy. So right now, if the model for so-called advanced societies like Australia, Europe, the United States, Canada, despite the fact that the Blue Jays are from Canada, I'm in Seattle, and Game 7 of the ALCS is tonight, so baseball's on my mind. If the model is, and this is the current reality based on U.S. law and regulations, etc., if that model continues where the burden is on the government or on independent scientists to compile sufficient, credible science linking something in Doritos to a specific adverse health outcome, low sperm count, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In the absence of that clear science that links something in the Dorito to a known adverse outcome, there's no legal basis in U.S. law for the FDA to tell the makers of Doritos to change how they make them. There's no basis. So under current law, the burden is on the public, on taxpayers, independent researchers, to prove that something in the food system is making people sick. The problem is, it's the food system that's making people sick. The whole thing. Not the Doritos, not the Pepsi, not the Starbucks cappuccino. And this goes back to what I said before. You can use Roundup safely on a 20-acre field. Any place in the world, it could be used very safely. In fact, I despite everything I know, I would urge anybody who's going to use a chemical to control weeds to use Roundup. There is no safer one that I know of. It can be used on that 20 acres on Will Harris's ranch safely. But when you use it so many different ways for so many different avenues where it can get into the food supply and into the environment, it's the totality that makes people sick. So what did I just say? You can't regulate Doritos because it's harming people, because you'll never be able to prove that one-to-one. But ultra-processed food and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, it's already been proven. The linkages are so clear, even with the flawed tools that we have now to detect them. So I guess what I'm saying is, as part of reductionist science and specialization that have been such reliable drivers of progress in so-called advanced societies, we've backed our way in a corner where we can't see the forest for the trees anymore. We spent all of our time trying to find what it is about Doritos that's giving people fatty liver disease. And, science will find things that are likely associated. But I guarantee you that 95% of the people with a chronic disease in the world that comes from the environment. So it's not in their genes. It's not from something they're exposed to at work, like if they're breathing vinyl chloride all the time. 95% of chronic disease is brought about by a very complex mixture of causes that play out over a decade or two. It's never one thing. It's always, and bad timing and bad luck plays a big role in this, because if you happen to get an infection at the same time you get exposed to a lot of Roundup, and the Roundup goes into your bone marrow and starts screwing up your hematopoietic stem cells, as we know it does, and some of the DNA is damaged in a way that those dividing red blood cells are on their way to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If a person's immune system's dealing with an ear infection, or maybe they had a knee replacement and they're on a bunch of antibiotics, or any number of combination of things, that's what causes chronic disease. How the hell do you regulate the random events that occur over a lifetime? Nobody's figured that one out, which is why we have to shift gears from basically a reductionist, chemicals are innocent until proven guilty mindset to recognizing and defining the state of health. Here is a healthy farm. Here is a healthy pond. Here is a healthy airshed. Here is a healthy child. And try to figure out what it is we need to do to promote and sustain the state of health. And if we do that, I think we can make progress. But we have to change the laws, because the things that have to change to bring that about are things like you don't make any more PFAS. You don't make any more paraquat. You don't convert food into biofuels. I mean, the only way that we can deal with those big multi-sector, multi-causes factors that undermine health of the pond, the beehive, the human being, is to deal with these bigger broader and often ubiquitous things that are undermining health. And we don't have the tools to do that now. Now, if that doesn't give you a headache, I don't know what will. I'm just such a cheerful guy, right?
I just hope your baseball team wins, mate.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I think you've given us an incredible perspective on so many items, and I want to leave on, if we can find, a note of hope for our audience. What do you, like, if you were to reimagine what's possible, what would our food system and what could our food system look like in 20 years' time, and how do we leave a better future for our generations to come? Can you answer that in?
Yeah, and again, I'll answer it based on the problems and challenges in developed countries that are using current genetically engineered crops and a lot of pesticides and have a lot of money. Because I mean, I know some about food insecurity and food issues in Africa and poor parts of Asia, but not enough to. I just don't feel comfortable speaking to what needs to happen there. But in the United States, in Australia, and Europe, the CAFOs have to be broken up. The animals have to be spread out, and that's only going to happen through regulation. And I think ultimately it'll be too many nutrients in one area to be dealt with in a responsible way, which will drive that change. And it's a pretty easy one to bring about. It could be done by direct regulation. It can be done by taxes, et cetera. So that's one. A second one is we have to, as a world community, come up with a thoughtful way to transition the biofuels industry from where it's at now to where it ought to be and should be for a sustainable future, which is, I mean, right now, over 40% of the U.S. corn crop is going into ethanol. And I don't know what percent of the soybean crop is going to biodiesel. It's not up to 40, but it's headed in that direction. In 50 years, maybe 10% of the corn and soybeans will be going into biofuel applications, because in a jet airplane, you need a liquid fuel that's reliable. And you're not going to put a nuclear reactor or a bunch of solar panels on top of an airplane. So yeah, there will be a place and a role for the biofuels industry, but it's not going to be anywhere near as large in scope. And so, given that everybody knows that we need to at least double fruit and vegetable intake, so we've got to get, in the U.S., we have to get about another 10 or 12 million acres of fruits and vegetables. Where are those acres going to come from? Well, they're going to come from acres that are growing animal feed now. Acres in the West that are growing alfalfa, growing silage corn, growing cotton. None of those crops would be grown there without the subsidies that are flowing to those sectors. So you repurpose those subsidies in a way that you support farmers growing almonds and cucumbers and tomatoes. And you really want to feed the world on a few acres? Grow sweet potatoes. Incredible nutrients in sweet potatoes, and 25 tons an acre. I mean, the yield of sweet potatoes. Now, sweet potatoes they're much harder to get to people as opposed to regular potatoes. But so where water is scarce and there's multiple demands on water, which of course is the Western U.S., and parts of India, there's a band all the way around the world where there's not enough water to meet other needs and agricultural needs based on the way it's being used now. But if you convert all irrigation systems to modern drip systems and stop growing animal feed and instead grow human feed, you can cut agricultural water use by way over a half and grow more food for humans. And the animals have to move back into the areas where it rains. So rain-fed alfalfa, rain-fed crops will be fed to those animals. So those are the kind of two of the big macro changes. And then we just have to get to the point where society say, we're going to feed babies organic food, period. That's all. Babies and kids should have organic food through age 16, almost all organic food. It's crazy to expose young growing bodies and minds to chemicals if you can avoid it. And again, the baby food industry in the U.S. could have gone 100% organic 30 years ago. If there was some reason to do so, but there's no reason for it to do it. So it's making plenty of money now. So why change? Well, something's got to drive that change. And the big problem in the U.S. For organic is the fact that the USDA is really been captured, corporate capture, just like the Congress, just like agencies, other agencies, by corporate interests. And it is just not possible for officials in the U.S. Department of Agriculture to speak truthfully to the American public about the benefits of organic food and farming. If they do, they lose their jobs. And everybody knows it. So the U.S. government has systematically protected the American public from the information and knowledge and data and research that would inform the American public about how much safer their kids and their families could be if there was more organic food available. People in the U.S., they've heard enough of the greenwashing from corporations, et cetera. Oh, there's really no difference in organic. They're big farms and they use pesticides. There's really no big differences. They've heard that enough through enough channels that a lot of people, they don't know if it's true. They don't have the time to sort it out. But what it does do is it undercuts their willingness to take a goddamn stand and say, I want organic food for my family. Because that's what's happened in a lot of European families. European governments don't muzzle their scientists. And when their research shows that organic food is better for people or the environment, they're allowed to talk about it in public and they don't lose their jobs. Well, how's that for a radical notion? And that's why, organic food in several European countries is at least double the penetration that it is in the U.S. You go to Washington State, where I'm sitting right now outside of Seattle. There's this incredibly productive fruit and vegetable growing area, about 50 miles to the east, irrigated out of the Columbia River. It's one of the most valuable farming areas on the planet, and it just grows fantastic apples, pears, peaches, grapes, lettuce, cucumbers, tomatoes, all of the fruits and vegetables that people need to get and stay healthy. And in the tree fruit industry, they're pushing 20% organic. And almost all farms have some organic acreage. And you ask the vast majority of them, well, are you interested in growing more organic? And they say, yeah, sure we are, because usually it's cheaper and more profitable. Why don't you do it? No demand. There's not the demand. We don't want to so flood the organic market so that there's no premium. The states of Washington, Oregon, and California that have similar politics need to band together in in a regional effort, independent of the federal government, and promote the hell out of organic farming and basically switch 80% of fruit and vegetable production all up and down the West Coast to organic, which would obviously more than meet demand in the US. All kids could eat organic. Plus, these farmers will make a lot more money shipping high quality organic food to the Middle East, where they'll spend $15 on a cantaloupe. People have spent $100 on a watermelon in Japan. People in Japan, valued presents on birthdays, anniversaries, will be a box that has 6 perfect, beautiful organic strawberries in it, in a little individual, and they're in a very ceremonious way for a dessert one night. The host will cut up the strawberries, and there'll be slices given to the people around the table. And as they slowly eat these wonderful, ripe, just strawberries with flavor that explodes in your mouth, it's worth it to them. It's and they get a lot of nutrients, but they don't eat a lot of them because they can't afford it, because they spent $25 for 6 strawberries. So that's the West Coast has all those people in Asia that are very eager and also economically in a position to afford that kind of food, not every day, but often. And the even the food that they eat day to day is much higher quality than what is in the stores now in the Western U.S. So there's there's I keep coming back to the theme. There's no reason for the U.S. food system to be as screwed up as it is, other than that's what we're paying for. That's what we're allowing through our political choices and through how we spend our food dollars. And when enough people become convinced that it doesn't have to be that way, that we won't all starve if Congress passes a law that baby food has to be organic, then it can happen. But it just hasn't happened yet.
I look forward to the day that we can have another conversation post it happening. Charles,
Okay.
It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today. I look forward to you revising the Farm Bill in the US and running for Senate sometime soon, because you're one of the people we need in there.
Well, not a snowball's chance in hell I'll be running for Senate, but I wouldn't mind providing some free coaching to some of the new young senators that are likely to get elected in the next cycle, because they're going to go in, they're going to be on 3 different committees, and they need to be technically proficient experts in about 20 different fields at once, which is of course impossible. So that's the one thing about me. I've been this sponge for information my whole life, and I'm because I've been doing it for a long time, I can help people in an hour conversation, move up the learning curve. And especially if you're able to have these conversations with people every week or two, you can only move people so far in one conversation, but if you can have several of them, somebody can go from not knowing hardly anything about food and ag policy to knowing a fair amount in just a year. And I plan on doing as much of that as I can, because it's just a useful thing to do with the fruits of my interesting career. I mean, there's so many people have invested in me and provided me with information, and now I'm going to try to give back some in these tumultuous times.
Well, you've certainly given back a lot to our audience here today, and I know that they've moved into more knowledge and more relationship because of your words. So thank you for joining us, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to more. Best wishes for the big game this evening.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
hour and a half.
there you
Starts
go,
in
mate.
an hour and a half. Yeah.
I especially thank you for taking time out of what is a very important day, and many blessings to you and your family. It's been a beautiful conversation, and we're lucky to have you here.
Well, I haven't been to Australia since I did my month-long speaking tour on GMOs probably 20 years ago. So perhaps the stars will align and I can come visit you on your home turf.
Let's plant that seed.
Okay. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Chuck. Cheers. Charles, thank you for bringing both clarity and vision to this conversation. It's clear that the way forward not only requires science and policy, but also courage, imagination, and collective will. And to our listeners, the invisible ingredient in our food system doesn't have to be chemicals. It can be care, connection, and stewardship. May we all carry that vision forward into the choices we make every day. Thanks for listening. See you soon.